The Pacific War was brutal, unforgiving, and filled with images of unimaginable suffering. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary endurance, often facing overwhelming odds, and many expected death rather than capture. For those who were taken prisoner by the Americans, a profound sense of dread accompanied every step of the journey into captivity. In their minds, the enemy was ruthless, a power that would starve, beat, and perhaps even execute them. Their fears were rooted in years of propaganda and strict indoctrination that painted the United States as a nation of cruelty. Yet, when these men finally set foot on American soil, the reality they encountered was nothing like the nightmare they had imagined. Imagine the moment of arrival. A young soldier, barely 20 years old, steps off the transport ship with his hands bound, expecting hostility from every direction. He braces for insults, for the whip of a guard's baton, or for the hunger of an empty stomach. Instead, he sees rows of orderly barracks, neatly built and surrounded by wire fences that feel less like cages and more like boundaries. He smells food being prepared in kitchens nearby, the scent of bread and meat carried by the wind. There is confusion in his eyes, and whispered questions spread quickly among the prisoners. Could this be real, or was it some trick meant to break their spirit? The truth of American prisoner of war camps was staggering for men who had grown up in a militarized Japan. They had been told to expect nothing but pain and humiliation, yet here they found structure, order, and even a degree of humanity. Life was still restricted, freedom was gone, and there was no denying the loss of dignity in being captured. But the small details of daily life spoke of something unexpected. Beds with blankets, bowls of food filled to the rim, and guards who did not strike them without reason, all became startling revelations. For Japanese soldiers hardened by jungle warfare, the very sight of abundance was almost unbearable. They had survived on scraps in humid forests, where disease and starvation were as dangerous as bullets. The memory of chewing on rice balls that had gone sour or eating whatever could be scavenged lingered in their minds. To be presented suddenly with meals that seemed rich, even ordinary by American standards, was like stepping into another world. Hunger had been their companion for so long that the first taste of bread or coffee in captivity felt like both a miracle and a cruel reminder of what they had lacked. The context of their arrival also deepened this shock. At home, Japan was crumbling under the weight of war. Cities burned under relentless air raids, families endured shortages, and soldiers at the front were told that suffering was honorable. Against that backdrop, the American camps seemed to belong to another age altogether. It was as though the prisoners had been transported not just across an ocean, but into another reality, one in which even enemies lived surrounded by comfort. The war had taught them to expect pain. Instead, they were confronted with abundance. What made these early impressions so powerful was the element of disbelief. Many prisoners could not trust their senses. They whispered at night, wondering if the bread was poisoned, or if the unexpected kindness of their guards was a calculated manipulation. Fear lingered, but slowly suspicion gave way to astonishment. It became harder to deny what their own eyes and stomachs confirmed. This was not the world they had been warned about. The hook of this story lies in that sudden reversal. Men who expected death found life. Soldiers who braced for suffering encountered comfort. The irony was sharp, and it etched itself into their memories in ways that no battlefield experience could rival. These first moments of captivity set the stage for everything that followed. The Japanese prisoners of war had stepped into a new chapter of history, one that would test their beliefs, their pride, and their very understanding of the world. For the viewer, it is crucial to imagine the scene not with hindsight, but through the eyes of those men in 1944 or 1945. The sound of boots on American soil, the glare of guards watching their every move, the smell of food drifting from a nearby hall, and the sight of barracks that seemed far too clean for prisoners. Every detail spoke of a contradiction. The war had taken everything from them, yet here, in the hands of the enemy, they were surrounded by a strange and bewildering comfort. This was the beginning of a story not about battles, but about the clash of worlds, where luxuries became the most shocking weapon of all. The contrast between what Japanese prisoners expected and what they found could not have been greater. Back in their homeland, life during the war was marked by scarcity and sacrifice. Rationing touched every household, and daily meals were reduced to small portions of rice, vegetables, and, if fortunate, scraps of fish. Soldiers on the front endured even worse, often forced to stretch meager rations across weeks of hardship. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, and the idea of plentiful food felt like a memory from another lifetime. When they arrived in America and saw tables laid out with bread, butter, meat, and steaming cups of coffee, the shock was visceral. Imagine a man who had not eaten to fullness in months being handed a plate that looked like it belonged at a festival. The bread was soft, the butter creamy, and the coffee bitter but rich with warmth. To American guards, it was a standard meal, something unremarkable. To the prisoner, it was almost unthinkable luxury. Some could hardly bring themselves to eat, suspicious that it might be a trick or a test. Others devoured it greedily, unable to resist the smell and taste that filled their senses with both joy and disbelief. The physical environment of the camps only deepened this contrast. Japanese soldiers expected crude shelters, perhaps cold wooden shacks or tents on muddy ground. Instead, they found barracks with wooden floors, beds with blankets, and roofs that kept out the rain. Though guarded and confined, the spaces were orderly and even provided a sense of dignity compared to the harsh and degrading conditions they feared. To men raised in a culture where endurance of suffering was a virtue, this level of provision felt almost disorienting. They could not reconcile the image of America as a brutal enemy with the reality before their eyes. The treatment they received also stood in stark contrast to their expectations. In Japanese-controlled territories, prisoners of war were often subjected to harsh labor, physical punishment, and starvation. Many Japanese soldiers assumed the Americans would treat them with the same cruelty. Yet, although discipline existed and freedom was gone, they were not beaten without cause, nor were they deliberately starved. Guards enforced rules firmly, but they did not take every opportunity to degrade or torment their captives. This revelation forced the prisoners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their enemy lived by a different code than the one they had been taught. Over time, the daily routine of life in captivity made this contrast unavoidable. Meals arrived on time. Medical care, while limited, was still available. Even small details, like soap for washing or shoes that actually fit, reminded the prisoners that they were living in a system of abundance. Each reminder carried both relief and humiliation. Relief because their survival seemed assured. Humiliation because it revealed how far Japan lagged behind in providing even the simplest necessities. It was as if the very act of living in an American camp forced them to measure the gulf between the two nations. For many prisoners, the difference was not only material, but psychological. They began to realize that the war was not fought on equal terms. While Japan had demanded endless sacrifice from its people, America seemed capable of fighting a global war while still maintaining a society of comfort. That discovery was as painful as it was astonishing. Each loaf of bread, each blanket, and each act of ordinary civility drove home the reality that Japan was fighting a power not just militarily stronger, but fundamentally different in its relationship with its people. The shock of this contrast remained a constant theme in the lives of Japanese prisoners. It was a daily reminder of the lies they had been told, the sacrifices they had made, and the enormous gap between expectation and reality. For some, it was a bitter lesson that deepened their sense of loss. For others, it opened their eyes to a world beyond what they had known, a world where comfort was not seen as weakness, but as a natural part of life. This contrast, stark and undeniable, would shape the way they remembered their captivity long after the war was over. To understand why Japanese prisoners of war were so stunned by their treatment in America, one must look back at the contrasting wartime experiences of the two nations. Japan entered the war with an economy already strained by years of conflict in China and by limited access to resources. The nation had committed itself fully to the idea of total war, mobilizing every household and every worker for the empire's survival. Food was rationed heavily, clothing was repaired and repurposed, and luxuries had all but vanished. Sacrifice became a national expectation, and endurance was praised as a mark of loyalty to the emperor. For soldiers sent abroad, hardship was not only expected, but embraced as part of their duty. In this environment, suffering became a form of virtue. Soldiers were taught that to endure hunger, cold, and exhaustion was honorable, while seeking comfort was a sign of weakness. Training camps prepared them for this reality with strict discipline and harsh conditions. They were told repeatedly that capture was worse than death, and that if captured, they should expect unending torment. Japan's own treatment of enemy prisoners reinforced this view. Stories of starvation, forced labor, and cruelty spread among the ranks. cementing the belief that their fate in enemy hands would be equally grim. With this mindset, surrender meant not only dishonor, but also certain misery. America's position was entirely different. Its vast industrial output, rich natural resources, and relatively secure homeland allowed it to fight a global war without stripping its citizens of every comfort. Factories ran at full capacity, but grocery stores were still stocked, and families continued to live with a level of abundance unthinkable in Japan. Even with rationing at home, the average American diet included meat, dairy, and coffee, items that had become rare luxuries in Asia. This wealth of resources extended to the military, which could feed and equip its troops far beyond the standards of most other nations. Prisoners of war, by extension, were also swept into this system of abundance. The contrast between the two systems was rooted in more than just material supply. It reflected a fundamental difference in how each nation approached the idea of war. Japan glorified sacrifice and suffering, elevating the endurance of hardship into a cultural ideal. America, by contrast, framed its war effort around preserving a way of life that included comfort and plenty. To the Japanese, the notion that an enemy would continue to live well even in wartime was almost incomprehensible. When prisoners saw with their own eyes that American civilians and soldiers alike enjoyed things that were scarce in Japan, the realization shook them to their core. These backgrounds also explain why disbelief was such a common reaction among the prisoners. Their training and cultural upbringing had not prepared them for kindness or comfort from an enemy. The very possibility seemed to contradict everything they had been told. For months or years, they had lived under the assumption that captivity would mean abuse and starvation. Yet the reality of American camps challenged this foundation, leaving them in a state of confusion. It was not only the presence of luxuries that stunned them, but the revelation that their worldview had been built on falsehoods. This clash of origins also revealed the larger forces shaping the war itself. Japan's economy had been stretched thin, unable to match the scale of American production. The empire relied on the discipline and sacrifice of its people to fill the gaps, hoping that spirit could overcome shortages. America, on the other hand, wielded both spirit and material wealth. This imbalance was not only felt on the battlefield, but also in the small daily experiences of captivity. The shock that prisoners felt was therefore not only personal, but symbolic of the broader divide between the two nations. Ultimately, the origins of this contrast lay in the very different paths Japan and America had taken into war. One believed in victory through endurance and sacrifice, the other in victory through abundance and efficiency. When the two collided, the prisoners became living witnesses to the consequences of those choices. Every piece of bread and every blanket in the American camps told the story of that divide, making their astonishment not just an emotional response, but a reflection of history itself. For Japanese prisoners of war, the shock of abundance within American camps was not confined to their immediate surroundings. Every loaf of bread, every cup of coffee, and every blanket reminded them of the vast machine that had made such provisions possible. It was not simply that their captors were feeding them well, but that America had the capacity to do so even while fighting a global war. This realization carried heavy implications. It revealed to the prisoners that the strength of the enemy was not rooted only in weapons or soldiers, but in the sheer power of an economy that could sustain luxury even in the midst of destruction. On the battlefield, the consequences of this imbalance were already clear. American soldiers fought with steady supplies, often carrying equipment and rations that would have seemed unimaginable to their Japanese counterparts. Where Japanese troops sometimes lived on a handful of rice and whatever could be foraged from the land, Americans had canned meat, chocolate bars, and cigarettes in abundance. The very idea that such luxuries could be present at the front underscored the material difference between the two sides. For Japanese prisoners reflecting on their own struggles, captivity was a daily reminder of why their forces had been so badly outmatched. Imagine the mental weight of such a realization. A soldier who had fought with courage and endured starvation now sat in a camp where food was plentiful. The message was unspoken but undeniable. The war had not been fought on equal terms. Spirit, sacrifice, and discipline could not overcome the vast material advantages that America possessed. For many prisoners, this was the most painful lesson of all. Their pride in endurance and self-denial seemed hollow when confronted with an enemy who fought from a position of comfort and strength. The experience also shifted how prisoners interpreted their own suffering during the war. What once felt like noble sacrifice now appeared as evidence of weakness. They had believed that hunger and hardship were shared burdens that made their nation stronger. In captivity, they learned that these burdens had not been inevitable, but the result of Japan's inability to provide. This revelation undermined the very foundation of their military ethos. Each meal in the camp became a reminder of the limits of sacrifice when faced with overwhelming industrial power. On a broader level, the POW camps themselves became symbolic battlegrounds. They demonstrated to captured soldiers the contrast between two systems of war. One demanded total sacrifice from its people, stripping away comforts until little remained. The other fought with resources so vast that even enemies were housed and fed with dignity. This was not only a humiliation, but also a revelation of how wars were truly won. The prisoners, in their shock, became witnesses to the fact that battles were decided not just by bravery, but by the strength of factories, farms, and supply lines. For the Americans, this contrast was unintentional but powerful. The simple act of maintaining order and providing for prisoners became a form of psychological warfare, showing the enemy a reality that no propaganda could hide. It was not cruelty, but comfort that broke through the mental defenses of the captured soldiers. In this way, the impact of the battlefield extended beyond guns and bombs. It continued in the quiet moments of captivity, where food and shelter carried as much weight as weapons had in combat. Ultimately, the battlefield had taught the Japanese prisoners about death, endurance, and sacrifice. The camps taught them about power, abundance, and disparity. Together, these lessons reshaped their understanding of the war. They could no longer see it simply as a struggle between two armies of equal determination. Instead, they recognized it as a confrontation between two worlds, one sustained by sacrifice and scarcity, the other by resources and abundance. The impact of this realization would follow them long after the guns fell silent. The shock of captivity in America did not remain an isolated experience. As Japanese prisoners slowly adjusted to the rhythms of camp life, they began to process what this contrast between expectation and reality truly meant. Meals that once seemed too generous to be real became a part of daily routine. Barracks that felt foreign at first became familiar spaces. Yet behind this adjustment lay a deeper transformation. The men were forced to confront the fact that their enemy was not the monstrous figure painted by propaganda, but a society capable of both strength and generosity. This revelation planted quiet but enduring questions about their homeland, their leaders, and the war itself. For many prisoners, this realization was uncomfortable. It undermined the values they had been taught since youth. In Japan, they had been told that suffering was noble and that endurance was the foundation of national pride. But in captivity, suffering was absent, replaced by the steady presence of abundance. Soap, shoes, and food were available in ways they had never known. To accept this reality was to admit that their nation had failed to provide, even while demanding everything from its citizens. It was a subtle but powerful consequence, one that would follow them for years to come. The psychological effect reached beyond the walls of the camps. The very existence of such treatment revealed the imbalance of global power. America's ability to extend comfort to its prisoners was a demonstration of industrial might on a scale the Japanese could hardly comprehend. It meant that while their families at home were scraping by with limited rations, their captors could afford to feed the enemy. This realization was both humbling and infuriating. It showed them that Japan's struggle was never on equal terms. The sacrifices demanded of their people had not closed the gap. Instead, they only highlighted it. This contrast also had consequences for morale. Some prisoners began to soften in their view of America, seeing it as less cruel and more human than they had been taught. They noticed that guards treated them with restraint, that food came on time, and that survival was not in question. Such observations stood in direct opposition to their expectations of torment and abuse. It did not erase the pain of capture or the shame of surrender, but it shifted their perspective. They could no longer cling entirely to the image of an enemy defined by cruelty. The human face of America was impossible to ignore. At the same time, the broader significance of these experiences cannot be overstated. The war was not only a clash of armies, but also of systems. Japan relied on the discipline and sacrifice of its people, hoping that spirit could overcome material limits. America, however, fought from a position of abundance, using its industrial strength to maintain comfort even in wartime. For Japanese prisoners, living within that system as captives exposed them to truths that no battle could fully convey. They became unwilling witnesses to the decisive role of economic power in modern war. For some men, these realizations brought bitterness. They felt betrayed by their leaders, who had promised victory but delivered only ruin and hunger. Others experienced a kind of reluctant admiration, recognizing that America's strength lay not only in weapons, but in its ability to provide for its people. Either way, the consequences were profound. The memories of those contrasts between hunger and fullness, between cruelty expected and civility experienced, remained etched in their minds. It was as if their very captivity had become a lesson, one that revealed the true dimensions of the war. The wider consequences of these experiences extended far beyond the camps themselves. They reflected the reality of a world where industrial might determine the fate of nations. For the Japanese prisoners, the realization was personal and painful. For history, it was a clear sign of how the war would reshape global power. In this way, the luxuries that stunned them were not just comforts. They were symbols of a new order, one in which endurance alone could no longer decide the outcome of conflict. The moment of climax in the story of Japanese prisoners of war came when they finally accepted that their expectations had been shattered beyond repair. For weeks and months, they had struggled with disbelief, whispering among themselves about whether the food was poisoned or whether the comfort of the camps was some elaborate trap. Slowly, suspicion gave way to reluctant acceptance. The bread was not poisoned, the coffee was not a trick, and the guards did not strike them without reason. What they saw, smelled, and tasted was real. It was not a fleeting illusion, but the daily rhythm of life in captivity. This realization struck harder than any battlefield defeat. Imagine a soldier who once marched into battle with the belief that his spirit was stronger than any enemy weapon. Now he sat on a wooden bench, eating a meal that would have been considered a feast back home. The humiliation was not only in being a prisoner, but in recognizing that his captors lived in abundance even during war. Every bite of food carried a bitter sweetness, a reminder of his own nation's failure to provide. The moment of recognition was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. It was the climax of his journey from fear to astonishment, from hatred to reluctant acknowledgement. The prisoners could not escape this truth. It was present in the softness of the bread, in the smell of soap, in the simple fact that shoes were issued without question. These were small details, yet they spoke louder than propaganda or speeches. They told a story of a nation that fought wars with resources so vast that it could afford to show generosity even to its enemies. For men raised to equate sacrifice with victory, this was a devastating contradiction. It revealed that endurance alone was not enough when the enemy fought with both strength and comfort. The emotional climax unfolded in silence more than in words. Some men wept quietly when they realized they were eating better as prisoners than they had as soldiers in the field. Others refused to speak of it at all, unable to reconcile the shame. Yet all of them carried the same unspoken knowledge. The war had been unwinnable from the start. Spirit and discipline had value, but they could not replace bread, steel, and oil. The camps, in their abundance, had laid bare the truth that battles were lost not only on the front lines, but in the factories and supply chains that sustained armies. This climax was not a dramatic explosion, but a steady, crushing weight. It was the slow collapse of belief systems, the quiet breaking of pride, the realization that what they had been taught was wrong. It was the moment when America ceased to be the monstrous enemy of propaganda and instead became something far more difficult to face, a rival defined by strength and prosperity. That image could not be dismissed, for it was experienced with every sense, day after day, until denial was no longer possible. In many ways, this was the turning point of their captivity. The war was no longer just a distant memory of combat, but a daily reminder written into their surroundings. The climax lay in the acknowledgement that their struggle had been unequal from the start. The humiliation of defeat was sharpened by the astonishment of abundance, and in that mix of emotions, the Japanese prisoners reached the height of their journey. It was not on a battlefield that they felt the crushing weight of America's power, but in the quiet, routine moments of life inside a prisoner of war camp. As the war drew to a close and Japan surrendered, the story of these prisoners entered its final chapter. Repatriation began, and the men who had once lived in the surreal comfort of American camps were sent back to their homeland. The journey was filled with mixed emotions. Some were eager to return, carrying the shame of capture and longing to see their families again. Others dreaded what awaited them, for they knew Japan had been devastated by bombing, hunger, and defeat. The contrast between what they had seen in America and what they were about to face back home loomed heavily in their minds. When the prisoners finally returned to Japan, they stepped into a landscape of ruins. Cities lay in ashes, families survived on scraps, and the nation's pride was shattered. For men who had eaten bread and meat in captivity, the scarcity of home felt like stepping backward in time. The memories of abundance in America clashed with the reality of hunger in Japan, leaving them with a deep sense of disorientation. Some kept their experiences quiet, fearing that to speak of comfort under the enemy's watch would bring shame. Others could not help but share their astonishment, though their stories often met with disbelief or resentment. The legacy of their captivity was complicated. On one hand, it deepened the humiliation of defeat, for it highlighted how far Japan had fallen behind. On the other hand, it planted seeds of curiosity and even admiration for the strength of America. The enemy that had once been portrayed as cruel had shown itself capable of restraint and even compassion. For some, this was a bitter pill to swallow. For others, it was a glimpse into a different way of life, one that contrasted sharply with the sacrifices demanded at home. In this way, the experience of captivity lingered not only as a memory, but as a point of reflection for the rest of their lives. Beyond the individual stories of prisoners, the legacy carried broader meaning. The very existence of comfort in captivity underscored the decisive role of industrial power in modern war. It was not just bravery or discipline that determined outcomes, but the ability of a nation to sustain abundance even in conflict. America's wealth had allowed it to extend generosity where Japan could not, and that difference had proven decisive. For history, the stunned reaction of the prisoners became a quiet but telling testimony of how wars were truly won in the 20th century. The human impact of this legacy reached far beyond the camps. Some former prisoners went on to play roles in rebuilding Japan, their perspectives shaped by what they had seen in captivity. They carried with them memories of ordinary comforts that had felt extraordinary in wartime, and these memories influenced how they viewed progress and modernity in the post-war era. Others struggled with bitterness, unable to reconcile their nation's collapse with the abundance they had witnessed abroad. Together, these varied responses formed part of the hidden emotional landscape of Japan's recovery. Ultimately, the story of Japanese prisoners of war in America is not one of battles fought or victories won, but of revelations that challenged identity and belief. It is the story of men who discovered, in the quiet confines of captivity, the limits of sacrifice and the power of abundance. The luxuries that once stunned them were more than small comforts. They were symbols of a global order that was shifting, a reminder that the world after 1945 would be shaped not only by soldiers in the field, but by the economic might of nations. This was the final legacy, a silent but enduring truth carried home in the memories of men who had seen both ruin and plenty.